This episode is dedicated to Miss Annette Martin. May she rest in peace.
Paratopia, it's Jeremy from a cell phone because I have no internet, because I am moving. In fact, I don't even appear during this interview, but it's nice to have this time I have with Jeff before and after the show. So, hey, Jeff, how are you?
Hey, how are you?
Doing all right.
Tired yet?
Yeah.
Are you tired?
A little bit.
You being moving, have you?
I know. Hard to believe.
Yes, it is.
So how did it go? Oh, well, I guess we'll just wait and get to it.
It went well. It went great, actually. Really
Excellent.
Really enjoyed it.
So what should we talk about here? We've got exciting news, right? Project Core by this time tomorrow will be a go?
More or less.
More or less?
More, probably less, but a little of the more over the weekend. It'll probably debut on sometime at some point on Monday, more than tomorrow. More coding than I suppose anticipated, and it should be live probably by Monday, and we'll give out the URL for it when we get all straightened out. We're actually having an issue with getting a decent name that everyone can remember, since this is going to be fairly long term. We want to have an easy to remember URL, so unfortunately all the good ones are taken. So we're going to come up with
Project
something.
Core for us?
Yeah, no, that's not going to happen. But
what about ProjectCore.tv?
Yeah, that would suck, but at worst case scenario, this may be the answer. So we'll see what happens, but I'll let everyone
Remember when .tv was supposed to be the big thing? It was like, that was going to be the new thing, .tv.
Yeah, that really didn't happen.
Didn't really take off.
No. So, so Monday we should be in good shape, and I'll let everyone know. We'll have a link on the homepage, regardless of what the URL is. We'll have it up there. And everybody just spread it far and wide. I mean, put it on every message board that you go to. Maybe throw it in your signature so that anyone coming across it can give a click and hit the site. And like I said, collect as many as we can.
And they don't have to be all people who have had experiences. It can be somebody who wants to just write a work of fiction. What do you think it would be like to encounter Bigfoot? What do you think it would be like to be, quote unquote, abducted by aliens or whatever? We want works of fiction in there as well, and there will be a button for that right at the top of this thing.
Right. Is this a work of fact or fiction? Right.
Right. Because we want to do that comparison. What's the difference between somebody who says that they've had an experience and somebody who's just writing purely what they think it would be like?
Right.
I think, well, I have my thoughts on that. I don't want to jade the pool already, so I won't just give my thoughts on that.
Let that slide on, yeah. So that'll
be interesting.
That'll be one part, and just so everyone knows, that field will be a required field, whether it's a work of fact or fiction. So you can't submit unless you click one of those, one way or the other.
Yeah.
But yeah,
and if you need to pitch it to people, tell them they're going to be a part of history, because nothing like this has ever been done before. Lie.
No, that's right.
It's not such a lie. Just aggrandize the thing, will you?
Yeah. Throw it out there far and wide. Let's see what we can get, and so that'll kick off probably around sometime Monday, and we'll get a link up. So what else, Jer? What else is going on?
I don't know.
Are you tired, boy?
It's interesting that in this time of anti-structure for me, nothing spectacular on the paranormal front has been going on.
Yeah. Yeah.
So maybe it'll happen when I settle down back in Massachusetts.
I figure when you do that, that's when you might have a little action.
That's when it hits.
So you're blowing out of town when?
On Saturday.
Wow.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that?
I don't know. I was absolutely fine for a while, and then this last week I was depressed. But today, I've just been so busy. It's just, it's been fine. It's been like nothing,
Yeah.
Just I'm getting stuff done.
Yeah.
But I'm sure once I'm there, then I will reflect back on what the hell it is I'm doing with my life. Then I'll have that moment of, oh dear God, this actually happened. Now I've got to go to Hawaii.
Right.
But actually, what's funny is, as I was packing up, I found an old Oahu brochure from when I went to Oahu, and I thought, Hawaii, get ready, baby, because here I come. Like it gave me the butterflies all over again. So I know that this is the right decision. But you know what else is kind of creepy is how many Bud Hopkins things I came across. Like things that he has sent me, things that he's written to me, even a book, Missing Time, that he had autographed to my friend Paul Rayome back in high school when he went to some, book signing. Just all of these Bud Hopkins things kept popping up, and so that was kind of weird. And I had forgotten how many things that Bud has sent me. Because when I did the first Culture of Contact and when I had him on the show, we were in communication for a little bit there. He sent me a Phil Corso article and, his little handwritten note of, see, this is why this is all bullshit, that sort of thing.
Oh, okay.
So I found that interesting. And I had dinner with Harold Egallen and Carol Rainey.
Huh.
Last night, said my goodbyes to them, and I don't know. So
you pretty much set the role at this point.
Yep.
Well, you have anything else to add in here before we roll on? No, I don't think so. Okay.
Let's just get to the grooviness that is your interview.
Yes, with one parapsychologist, Loyd Auerbach, is on the show tonight, and I mentioned this in the interview that maybe the name might not be familiar to you, or maybe it is, but no question, if you look him up on the internet, you will definitely know his face. He has been on television for God knows how many years. I think he said 1983 was one of his first interviews on the boob tube, and since then you'll see him in just about any place that you go to look that has a parapsychological expert on. He will be the guy they go to. So let's roll on, and here's Loyd Auerbach. In Paratopia this week, I'm by my lonesome. Jeremy is off gallivanting for his move, but I have a great guest for you, and the man's name is Loyd Auerbach, and he is a parapsychologist. And if you have watched anything on TV since, about 1980, you've seen Loyd on the television. Am I right, Loyd? Is that true or false?
I'd say probably 83.
83, okay. Anyway, welcome to the program, Loyd. I'm glad to have you.
Thanks very much.
Glad to have you. I'm looking through your book, which there will be links to your various websites for our listeners to go to, but I'm also looking predominantly at your book, Ghosts, Spirits, and Hauntings, Am I Being Haunted?, which has original essays by yourself, Josh Warren, Andrew Nichols, our buddy Nick Redfern, among others. And I got to say, I'd have bought this strictly for your passages in here.
Thank you.
Yeah, because this is exactly the kind of thing on this program that we like to talk about, which is the deeper aspects of all of this stuff. And I think it's probably best served, since it's your first time on the program, to ask you the question, which is the textbook question. How did you get into this, and what kind of sparked you down the path of doing this? This is your life.
Well, I can kind of attribute it to a few influences, and going back to literally when I was a preschooler. So
wow.
It was. I'm a TV baby. I'm a product of television. My father worked for NBC, and I had a TV when I was 2 years old in my room. So it was shows like, especially early on, shows like Topper and One Step Beyond, especially One Step Beyond, which is still a great show to watch since it was real psychic experiences. And then comic books did it. Dark Shadows was a major influence for me. It sent me to the library to read books. I was also a little science geek, and because I was interested in both mythology and science, finding the books on parapsychology were really great. And of course, Star Trek and a show called The Sixth Sense in 1972 with Gary Collins, which really kind of pulled it all together for me. So I kind of, since I was a teenager, knew I wanted to be a parapsychologist.
And so how did you go about, getting that goal attained? I mean, that doesn't sound like it's an easy profession to even get involved in.
No, and when I actually had a parapsychology club in high school. We some of my friends and I, and thanks to a couple of teachers at my high school back in the New York area, I was able to start a club. And it was not a ghost hunting club. It was a club. We talked to or had lectures from a couple of local parapsychologists who I was able to connect to through a neighbor. And we did ESP tests and PK tests and a bunch of other things. And went out to lectures in a few haunted places. But what I had gotten some advice from these local parapsychologists and from J.B. Ryan himself when I wrote him a letter about our club. And it really was pretty much like study whatever you can that's in the sciences, either hard science or social science. And then in graduate school, start considering to do some work focusing your thesis or doctoral dissertation on something to do with psychic phenomena, which you can often do, even though the degree is not going to be parapsychology. And I was lucky enough at Northwestern University to switch into anthropology. I started out actually as astronomy, and had a advisor who was interested in parapsychology and many courses that were really about supernatural folklore and that have well suited me throughout the years. And fortunately hooked up with a parapsychologist at Mundelein College in Chicago who was doing a mini-series on kind of a non-credit class for folks on parapsychology and was bringing in some parapsychologists from around the country, and that's how I found out about John F. Kennedy University's fledgling graduate parapsychology program, and it was just the timing was perfect, and I took a year off from college and went right into the master's program.
Wow.
After that, worked at the American Society for Psychical Research in New York. Again, a lucky timing situation got me the job, and then back to JFK. The sad thing is that thanks partly to the real estate collapse of commercial real estate in the 1980s, we lost our major funder for the program, and that, coupled with some university politics, kind of killed our program at the end of the 80s.
Wow.
So, but, I kind of came by it honestly through graduate study, through work in the field, and so on. So.
Yeah, I mean, there's so few of you. I mean, there's a lot of people who claim to be, but there's very few of you. And that kind of gets us into my first question for you. And this is something we're always on the show talking about, a quote unquote paranormal experience. We predominantly, I would say, focus on the UFO question, but we've delved into ghosts a number of times. We've delved into the nature of consciousness and perception and all of that. So I guess the first question for you is, by definition, what is parapsychology?
Parapsychology is essentially the study of how consciousness, how the mind connects with the physical world and the not-so-physical world around us. We study phenomena of the mind, of consciousness itself, not the senses, not the brain necessarily, including extrasensory perception, which is information without the use of the normal senses. We study interaction without the use of the normal senses, or use of the normal physical body in other ways. That would be called psychokinesis, mind over matter, what we these days call mind-matter interaction. And we study the idea that consciousness can survive the death of the body. That's where the ghostly stuff falls in fact. So it's really, we are studying, I guess you could say we're studying consciousness itself and its features and abilities, as opposed to what psychology does, which is studying behavior and, the mind in relation to the brain, more or less.
Right. Which
is kind of why we're parapsychology, because we're studying something slightly different than what psychology does.
Now, you know it, I know it, everybody who listens to this program knows it, that, of course, the ghost, at least the paranormal ghost, quote-unquote, end of things on the media side we've been deluged. I mean, within the past 10 years, we have been deluged with all of this stuff. And I was reading through your chapter in this book, and I just want to quote this because I think it's brilliant. It said, because the media tends to separate ghosts and hauntings, and to some degree poltergeists, from psychic abilities, there's a great misconception that parapsychology has nothing to do with things. In fact, such phenomena are, by definition, psychic phenomena, and therefore part of the spectrum of what parapsychologists study. More than that, ESP and PK are essential to the various models of ghost and poltergeist, at least to the ones that make sense based on 130 years of research. I mean, when you say based on 130 years of research, do we know who the first people to start studying this in a really critical way were? Like, where this originated from?
Sure, we do. We have a very good history. In fact, people can get a lot of the materials from that very first history online for free, since the books are basically out of copyright now. It was the British Society for Psychical Research, the SPR, which still exists, was founded in 1882, and it was actually people before that who were doing the work and decided to found the Society for Psychical Research. Probably the best source for real good history is a book called The Ghost Hunters by Deborah Blum, who's a science journalist. It came out a couple of years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. It was a bestseller for a time on the New York Times bestseller list. It focused quite a bit on all of these early researchers, and often in the book on William James, who's kind of the father of modern American psychology, who has had a really interesting biographical retconning by folks in the psychology world who seem to ignore or completely have excised any of his involvement in the psychical research world, which is bizarre considering he was president of the American Society for Psychical Research early on. Well, we had hard scientists. We had physicists, folks who discovered elements, who developed X-ray machines. We had a lot of real folks in the real hard sciences and laboratory work at the time. And this is all during the Industrial Revolution. Kind of the materialism became very popular in science at that point. These were hard science guys. And many really key psychologists, too, in the early days as well. So it's not like this came out of nowhere. And like I said, you can find, if you go to archive.org or to Google Books and look for books from the Society for Psychical Research, or just put in psychical research as a search term, you'll get a lot of the early stuff. And there's hundreds of these books available now. Even the journals and proceedings from the ASPR and the SPR, the British and American branches. And they're available for free generally, or really low cost for the Nook and for the Kindle too.
Wow, great. I mean, when do you think, being as it started with a lot of high-level people, at what point, if you feel that this is the case, I mean, I certainly see it in the ufological sense of things, which I've been around for 25 years in that. I mean, you've seen it go from kind of a critical study point to all of a sudden there being a big backlash of kind of criticism and that sort of thing, and then your higher ups tend to shy away. The PhDs, there's a select few, but they're the mainstayers. You don't really get a lot of new people influxing into this. At what point do you think that it became a subject of almost borderline ridicule?
Well, the ridicule thing, I think, it's relatively recent, although there have always been people who've ridiculed stuff. But really, it was because science was headed towards a very materialistic viewpoint in terms of philosophy of science, which even psychology fell into, for that matter, for the most part. It separated away, or pulled away from some of the roots of psychical research and parapsychology. And really, the roots come before the SPR and before the scientists. It comes from spiritualism being such a popular phenomenon since 1848 in both the United States and Great Britain, and even more so in Great Britain. It's very popular in Great Britain today. And the researchers, because so many people were into spiritualism, which included not only talking to spirits, but also getting telepathic messages. And, the early SPR, by the way, studied dreams, because that was considered a psychic phenomenon. And they also studied hypnosis, because that was considered a psychic phenomenon. So these were all parts of the early charter of the SPR. And somewhere around especially around the 1920s, there's a couple things that happened. One thing that happened is that folks were being told that this is not an appropriate area for research because, frankly, it wasn't something you could easily study with physical science. And we had even a movement in psychology that, the behavioral movement in psychology started in the early 20th century also. And the other side of that is that the spirit mediums, who originally worked in the light, by the way, for the most part,
right.
There are always folks who are performers who were able to figure out how to fake it, and they moved more and more towards the dark, and it became a situation where you had even the real people had to go in the dark because that's what people expected.
Right.
And that created serious problems just in general, but more so because there were so many frauds out there.
Wow.
And I think in the 1920s, especially with Houdini and some of the other folks that were out there, we had a real big backlash because frankly, there were a lot of frauds, and the scientists couldn't do anything about them in general.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but in terms of what we see a lot today are photographs. We see a lot of photographs and a lot of video evidence of hauntings and spirits and whatnot. And as I understand it, that was not something that was studied for the purpose of capturing a ghost on film, but rather to catch the people faking stuff.
That was why infrared was really first used.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, it's totally for that. Part of the issue here is that we've never really looked at photographs. They've been interesting, but we've never really looked at photographs as being great evidence because there are too many possibilities. You don't control all the variables for that evidence. And especially today, especially over the last 15 years with the orb phenomenon, which is so ridiculous when it comes down to it.
Tell me about it.
It was around the UFO community even before the ghost people grabbed it.
Absolutely.
And photographs, and the same thing with EVP. EVPs might be a little better, but only in under certain conditions. But the reality is that it's a bit of evidence. It's absolutely not proof. I mean, the photograph is not proof of anything these days.
No.
It never has, and it really never has been. The early photographers, early spirit photographs, most of them were phony.
Right.
It was, a way for people to make money. And I've got some really great photographs from back then, and, there are so many issues that we just never really considered that good evidence. In some respects, the stories from people, the witness reports, even though those are not 100%, you can't count them 100%, but they're much better because you look at the patterns of those, and when you have thousands and thousands of reports, like with UFO stuff, where there's consistency across the reports, it's those patterns that show things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's been kind of my contribution to the field of ufology is, I'm a professional digital imaging guy, and so I've examined hundreds of photographs, and I've only recently come to, probably within the last 3 or 4 years, that I don't really want to do that anymore. Well, I mean, for frank reasons, is that, like I've told people, it doesn't, no photograph is going to tell you who's in it, where it came from, what it's made of, et cetera, et cetera. So really, you're correct in saying that evidence is not evidence of a lot.
Well, and what I find, and just to kind of give you a couple little background tips, when I was at Northwestern, I actually went into the astronomy program. J. Allen Hynek was the head of the astronomy department. Mm-hmm. And I volunteered at the Center for UFO Studies for several months, which was in his house at that time. This was back in the 70s. And part of what I ended up doing was going through UFO reports and photos and such and sorting them for Dr. Hynek. But, it was really actually good working with him because I got a really good perspective on the evidentiality of things like photography and such. And whenever I hear ghost hunters tell me that, I've got this great photo, this is proof that there's a ghost, it's like, the UFO folks have much better photographs than we do. and they have photographs taken when there were like dozens of witnesses. How in the world do you think that's not been proven?
Right. Exactly. That's exactly true. Well, one of the things, we're talking about Ghost Hunters being probably one of the top-rated shows on television, or at least it used to be. It used to pull a lot of ratings. And in your passage, you kind of go into a little bit of how the media has almost poisoned the pool in that sense, that now people think when they see a piece of equipment on a program or in the media, this is what I should get a hold of. And essentially that they're spending too much of their time coming up with investigative methods and hypotheses and models and theories that just repeat what early psychical research already knew. Or bastardizing it, I should say. When we're talking about, for instance, the standard EVP recorder, which is the tiny handheld jobs, and now they've graduated to even bigger and more sophisticated ones. As
opposed to the big old reel-to-reel that the early researchers used to use.
Right, exactly. It says in your book here that it saddens you to see people using EMF sensors without knowing why they were first proposed, and often without knowing how to understand the data that they present.
Right.
What were they first used for, and what was the genesis of that?
Well, I mean, the real genesis happened. It comes from research by Michael Persinger and Stan Krippner and a few other folks. We're looking at how the geomagnetic field of the Earth actually was correlated to psychic experiences. Persinger started in the late 70s with Krippner and others to publish papers looking at specific patterns that happen in spontaneous and laboratory research, spontaneous experience and laboratory research that indicated that highs and lows in the Earth's magnetic field seem to have at least a correlation to the kinds of certain types of ESP results in a laboratory, and also to what people were reporting to the labs and to places around the world. And some of us talking about this thought, well, what about looking for magnetic fields on a more local level? And we really, I mean, the intent was if we could get our hands on a geomagnetometer for real local stuff, that's what we really wanted to do, but those weren't available. Right. And one of my colleagues, Andy Nichols, and I didn't even know him at that time. He was in Florida. Coincidentally, we both discovered the tri-field meters, and it happened. I think I found it at a Whole Life Expo, and he may have done the same thing. And those were designed to really fill a niche for people who were worried about electronic pollution, technology pollution, right, and EMF that might cause cancer. And I talked to a guy who was selling them, who I happen to know through someone else, and I was telling him about Persinger's work. He said, why don't you just take one out and see what happens? Give it a spin. And lo and behold, I found in a haunting case, kind of a place memory case, there was a direct correlation between really unexplained high magnetic fields. We turned the power off in the house to make sure we weren't getting false readings, by the way. Right. And the spots where people were reporting things that were happening in a pattern. And so this was actually happening in several cases, and Andy had the same experience. I'm the first one to actually use one on TV, apparently.
Oh, nice.
And I wish I had a royalty, not for the TV show, but for the equipment.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
And unfortunately, the TV show, of course, didn't really show exactly, or didn't let me give an explanation for the backstory and such. But what we were trying to do was to use environmental sensors of any type and correlate them to people's experiences, especially close in time to when those readings would happen. Because the best you can do is correlate. You get unusual, anomalous readings that might be unexplained, and you can get readings that are explainable, but if they tie into people's experiences, then you can actually consider how the research needs to go, because maybe there is a relationship between sitting in a house under high-tension wires with high magnetic fields, electromagnetic fields, and your ghost experience. And it may or may not be a ghost-related thing. It may be a very brain-related thing. But we were looking for those kinds of relationships, and unfortunately now people seem to think of these things to detect ghosts.
Okay. Well, now that brings me to the question, which, this is something that I've kind of gone back and forth with. I mean, I want to get Dr. Persinger on the show at some point, but I remember listening to him a while back, and he was talking about if you stimulate this part of the brain, you'll get a very distinct kind of experience.
That was his next step, yeah.
Right. And so when he does this, and up until recently, I was under the impression that he believed that all of this phenomena was gauged within the brain and electrical disturbances within the brain. But we had a lady on the show, and I'm forgetting her name right now, but I can edit it in later, who wrote a book, and she had interviewed him, and he seemed to have changed his mind a bit in terms of what people perceived may be more or less like a radio tuner, where they are seeing unrecognized other perceptions that may or may not be a product or a byproduct of this effect on the brain.
Here's an interesting thing. He using magnetic fields similar to the Earth's magnetic field, he can cause somebody to see an apparition in the laboratory or have an experience. But here's the problem. That may be what's going on in a home. A natural field hits the brain and causes you to see an apparition, but there's nothing that explains why that apparition has a verifiable bit of information in it or can provide you with information that you did not know.
Okay.
Or is historically accurate.
Okay.
So there's an extra piece here that he can't get in the laboratory because, frankly, the lab probably doesn't have that kind of history.
Right.
But put his laboratory on Gettysburg battlefield, maybe there'd be a slightly different result.
Now, can you give me a really quick example of what this has been a big thing, of course, in ufology when people, I mean, Jeremy and myself both are experiencers of the phenomena itself. Mm-hmm. And that's been our big thing is what can you bring back out of an experience that you wouldn't have known? And this has happened, half a dozen times where we've tried to go over our own experiences and say, is there something here that we couldn't have known or couldn't have known about, and so on and so forth. What would be a good example of that in your case files that would say this apparition conveyed something that the person could not possibly have known?
Well, I think one of the best cases I've had, one of my very first cases, or I shouldn't say my first, but one of my early cases that provided a lot of really clear information from an apparition. Family had been independently seeing a woman's ghost from the time they moved into this house. Apparently it was the woman who used to live there. And she'd been dead for a year and a half. She didn't die in the house. She died in the hospital of terminal cancer. And they weren't talking to each other until about a year and a half into this when their 12-year-old son brought up the topic of the ghost that he was talking to for a year and a half, and how come they didn't want to talk about the ghost. And when the mother asked, well, how do you know that we're seeing the ghost? He said, well, Lois told me. The ghost told me. So in the process, the interview process that we did, we sat down. First of all, we were greeted at the door by the boy and his mother and his grandmother who was visiting, who had also seen the ghost. And he then points to an empty space next to him and says, this is Lois. And, of course, we said hello because it was impolite not to. And we ended up hearing, as we were taken around the house, we were given a lot of history of the town of Livermore, which, frankly, he could have gotten from a book or from several books. But then we get these family stories. And my mind is racing through the whole process. How am I going to verify these? Because this woman only had one living relative, according to the mother here, who they bought the house in an estate sale. So they knew there was somebody still alive. Okay. And when we sat down, the first thing I did was I asked, well, how do we contact this cousin of yours, this relative of yours? And Chris looks over at the there's an empty chair there where the ghost is supposedly sitting. Right. And he turns back and he tells us the name and the phone number and how to get hold of the guy. And, okay, he might have still found that information. But beside the fact that we were able to interview the ghost about her existence and got some really interesting answers that I would never have gotten from a 12-year-old at that period of time, I was able to contact this guy who's 92 in an assisted living facility. He was ecstatic to hear that his cousin was still not alive, but around. And I went to visit him, and I started every one of the family stories, and he finished them. So either this kid had found a series of diaries, of journals. And memorized. There was some, and then the other part of it was, on our drive down, I had two of my students with me, and on the drive down we had a particular discussion not having anything to do with the case, kind of getting to know one of the students, and the other one was complaining about her job down in San Francisco working for a law firm, and we were talking about my car that was barely going to make it that time. So the last thing that I said, does Lois have any questions for us? And beside the question, this was 1985. The first question was, do you carry blasters, ever use blasters like in Ghostbusters? And we had to kind of laugh that off. And then the question was, Loyd, what kind of new car do you want to buy? Joanna, why do you want to quit your job in San Francisco? And Kip, how long were you a professional dancer in Los Angeles? And now I had a tape running from the time we walked in till when we left, and there was nothing on it. Unless the car was bugged, or unless the kid was reading our minds, there is literally no way that could have come to light, could have come out.
Wow. Did you get into see, this is the thing with me is I always swore that if I saw a ghost, that the first thing out of my mouth should be, where are you? Or something to that effect. I mean, is there ever been a communication where you ask a ghost, what are you here for? What is life like for you? What is your existence? What do you see? I mean,
that's all stuff that we did ask this kid that were asked the ghost, and the kid actually gave it to us. And that's why I said he gave us stuff that I can't believe that a 12-year-old. First of all, it would have been really hard at that time to find a book that was in print, which would give you any idea that would line up with what we knew in parapsychology about this. And then the responses were as far as she knew, she was just a ball of energy, of mental energy, kind of like some of those aliens on Star Trek. talking about the original series. And there were very specific responses. How come Chris can see you? How come you're wearing clothing? I asked, where does the clothing come from? How are you seen in particular? Sometimes she was in different ages, for that matter. And the responses were about things like, well, as far as I know, I'm just broadcasting what I look like to you, how I feel that day, and that's what he picks up. Oh. So kind of a telepathic impression thing. And I asked why she was there, and she said, well, when she was dying in the hospital, she knew she was going. She did her kind of life review and realized, A, she wasn't very religious, and B, she didn't know if there was a heaven or hell, didn't know what was next, and all she wanted to do was go home. So she remembered, according to the boy, she remembered closing her eyes in the hospital, and the next thing she knew was she was in her living room.
Wow.
So all of this is coming out in this one session, and frankly, the family had no motivation. They were not talking about this to the press. They didn't want the press. This was not about being afraid of the ghost, because they weren't. This was because they were curious what we would think,
right?
What my response would be, and it just was almost, it was like hand it to me on a silver platter in that sense. And we've had other cases where I've been able to ask questions, and the answers you get are very, very similar. Like one of the questions that we asked through Annette Martin. My colleague who just passed away at the Moss Beach Distillery, a restaurant where we've had kind of a long-term bunch of communications with ghosts there. Where do you go when you're not like here? What's it like for you? And the response was similar to other situations, which was, I don't have a body, so time doesn't flow the same way for me.
Huh.
And really, it's probably a perception of time, because we, as human beings, we have bodies with a body clock, and we have a lot of physical cues that cue us on. But when you don't have a body, it's like laying in a sensory deprivation tank suddenly. Time passes differently. So a lot of the responses are very similar to that, and we get across the board, looking historically and more recently, when people have taken the time, either witnesses or psychics with researchers around, asking questions like, why are you still here? You get a range of answers, which is perfectly normal considering you get a range of people who are dead.
Right.
If it was all one answer, like some psychics say that all ghosts are unaware that they're dead, or all ghosts have unfinished business, or it's like, well, you can't say that about all people, so I can't claim you can say that about all ghosts.
Right. Well, your case about this young boy, it brings up a good point, which is also in your book, that there's an alternate theory, namely that the unconscious mind of a living person was somehow responsible for the events. Mm-hmm. And lo and behold, pursuing that line of reasoning, researchers found they were able to pinpoint certain individuals in cases as agents, quote unquote, of the activity. And then could even find stress or other emotional motivations that for the chaos that related directly to those agents. So this brings up a really good point in that how would one differentiate, and this is something that's been talked about a lot in these circles, how can we try and differentiate what could be some kind of projection of quote unquote agents of this sort of thing versus what we would refer to more as the real McCoy, but they're both sort of the real McCoy. They're both highly, compelling.
Yeah, it sometimes can be hard. The issue is that, first of all, in poltergeist cases, which very clearly 99% of them relate to living people, physical object movement. The things that happen, first of all, in poltergeist cases are, for the most part, physical. You either see the aftermath or you see the process, and no matter who's there, they can hear and see everything because it's purely physical things that are happening. Whereas in apparition cases, it's not. It's a mental phenomenon. Not everybody sees the ghost. Some people feel the ghost or hear the ghost, and some people don't experience anything. So that's one differentiator right there. You don't have to have any of the same people. There's not necessarily a pattern of who's around when the ghost is there. So versus poltergeist case, which is with, again, rare exception, you have the exact same people or person who's always there when we're dealing with it. With the apparition cases, we often have cases like my case I just talked about, where people are perfectly happy to have the ghost around.
Right.
In fact, the kid claimed that the ghost was helping him with his homework, and the mother said that his grades had gotten better. So, okay, there's issues around that. Ultimately, I mean, there is a model that says that all of apparitional stuff is a form of place memory, which is our third category, which is the environment holds information of its past. which includes information about people. So it's a bit of place memory coupled with a projection. So I go into a house that has a history. I pick up on who used to live there, and because I'm a little bit psychic and not aware of it, I kind of project that out, and other people pick it up also. And my mind, or the mind of myself and the next person who is picking it up, we unconsciously collude, and we create essentially what equivalent of the holodeck computer on Star Trek: The Next Generation.
Ah, okay.
So this thing can actually talk back to us and interact with us and so on. And at its furthest point, the next people who move into that house, my interaction, my friend's interaction with this projection have embedded itself into the environment, so the next people actually get the new information that came from our interaction as well. That's kind of that. Some of my colleagues seem to think that is a simpler explanation or an easier explanation to accept than the consciousness survives the death of the body. I find the other way around. I think it's actually much easier when you have a situation where the ghost has been there for decades with different people all getting the same or similar information, and there's a change in what's going on. That's more likely to be a conscious person rather than something related to the place memory and kind of a poltergeist projection in that sense.
Okay, I see where you're coming from on that. I mean, I want to give you a couple of instances that have happened to me, and this is purely selfish just for me, but the listeners will probably like to hear this anyway. I am in a room right now that a lot has gone on in, including feeling someone put their hands on my shoulders when no one was there. I mean, various things moving on their own, things being swept off shelves for no apparent reason. But one thing in particular that is mentioned in this book is apparitions of living people. And one night I was in here, and I've played guitar since I was 9 years old. I was in here cranked up to 11, and my son was upstairs, and my wife, I thought, was out in the living room. And I believe at the time my son's girlfriend was over. And my wife came to the door, leaned around the doorway, made eye contact with me, said my name, looked at me as if we have a problem. You know what I'm thinking. We've caught the girlfriend and the and the son fooling around, and I put the guitar down very quickly. I turned off everything. I went out, the doorway, and the house was black. My son was upstairs asleep. His girlfriend had left a couple of hours prior, and my wife was out in our backyard gazebo writing in her journal. She had not been in the house for well over an hour and a half or so. She said she'd been out there for a while. I saw her. I saw her very clearly, and made eye contact and heard her voice. This was unmistakable. So what is that?
Well, there's two possibilities. Actually, there's three possibilities. One is this was a very vivid projection of your mind. Another is it was, if she said if she was fully conscious and aware of what she was doing at the time, not sleeping, not dreaming, not having an out-of-body experience or a split awareness, then it most likely was the first versus the second. The second being when people are dreaming sometimes or have an out-of-body experience, sometimes where they project to, people can see them. This happens sometimes also kind of spontaneously with crisis apparitions where someone is in an accident or is feeling really ill and they project out a form that people can perceive. I think there was a recent movie called Charlie St. Cloud, which is a great example of that, and another one with Reese Witherspoon a couple of years ago called Just Like Heaven. And in fact, Bill Cosby's movie Ghost Dad, which was not a very good movie.
Right.
Same kind of thing.
Okay.
And then the third possibility is that you picked up on a very clear impression of place memory, of her imprinted into the environment. When people talk about hauntings, we talk about most of the time seeing into the far past, seeing something that happened a while ago. But the reality is that living people leave those impressions behind, not the dead. And the impressions can be very, very recent, like yesterday, for that matter. Okay. So I've had cases where they weren't much of a case because we were able to figure out what was going on right away, where people were really freaked out because they just saw a ghost, and when they realized who the ghost was, they really got scared because the ghost looked like them.
Ah, okay. Well, I'll just make note that was literally the second time that I've seen her. I saw her from the back standing at our dining room table. And she came down the stairs as this one, other her, was fading literally into the background of the room.
So you very well may have maybe sensitive to some impressions that are left behind in the house. Wow. A little bit of place memory.
And the second thing is, I would say within the past, 3 months or so, we've had drawers opening and closing that we can hear that are upstairs that are very distinct. We have very distinct handles on our chest of drawers and our bureaus and whatnot. And you'll be downstairs and you will hear someone rifling through those drawers and move from one room to the next. I heard this weekend. My wife was away on a trip. My son was at work, and it was just me and the dog. And all that was preceded by smelling perfume, which is something else you've mentioned here. Smell apparitions or smelling something. Well, I smelled something so incredibly strong that smelled like old Avon perfume that Grandma used to wear. So strongly the last time, or one of the last times, that I could almost taste it in my mouth. Is that an unusual thing to actually be able to taste a smell like that?
Well, smell and taste are linked very closely together. Taste is rarely involved in psychic experiences. Mm-hmm. Although, as a side note, an early parlor game in the 19th century, which for whatever reason fell out of favor, rather than doing card guessing, they would actually do food guessing. And they'd have a tray of different foods, and they'd send somebody out of the room, and everybody would try one food and try to send that flavor to someone. They'd have to come back in and identify the food that they picked up on.
Oh, okay.
It's all perceptual. It sounds like your place may actually be a hotspot for place memory. There may be elements of patterns of past events. Mm-hmm. How old is your house?
About 1951, 52.
So obviously you're not the first people to live there.
Oh, absolutely not.
And in the room that you're hearing the drawers being rifled through, are there drawers up there?
Oh yeah, absolutely. They're definitely our chests of drawers and bureaus that we can hear the distinct sound of the handles jiggling, that sort of thing.
You might attach, do a little spy work here and attach some very, very thin hair or fine thread that's going to break, and kind of tie those things down, and that way when if you hear the jiggling, if it jiggles, then the thread will break, and you'll know somebody's actually, if it's physically moved or if it's just the sound of that.
Oh, okay. All right, yeah. Well, there's been quite a few things. Like I said, things moving on their own a couple times violently to the point where, I'm not going to lie, it pissed me off more than it scared me.
Yeah. This past weekend, this pretty much ended when I heard a bump in the attic, and when I went up and investigated the attic and saw there was absolutely nothing there, and I came back down the stairwell, on the landing at the top of the stairs is a bathroom, and that bathroom door closed on its own, and that door is rather hard to close. And so maybe you do have somebody there.
This is what I'm thinking. Yeah. That pretty much removed all doubt for me, and I'm usually, I don't know, I try to parse everything out critically and say, okay, what could this be, or what might I have seen? But that kind of removed a little bit of doubt for me. Mm-hmm. In the way of, and I just want to get to these before we run out of time, and I know we're quickly doing that. Something that we've talked a lot about on the show, we had George Hansen. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work.
Oh, I know George, yeah.
Marginality and anti-structure. What is your take on how all of that figures into paranormal manifestations?
Well,
I know that's a big question.
Yeah, it's almost too big a question to respond to here.
Yeah.
Now, George has a very particular perspective on the phenomenon he calls the trickster phenomenon.
Right.
And psi itself, going back to the research of Rex Stanford and other people, is that trickster phenomenon. It seems to tease us, and it is on the outskirts all the time. PK, for example, is a really good phenomena to kind of point to for that phenomena. I used to work years ago with an individual named Martin Caden, who was a sci-fi writer, in fact, and science writer, and he was able to do psychokinesis under relatively controlled conditions, under very, very well controlled conditions. And when we tried to figure out, we tried to measure for static electricity, and we didn't get anything. Everything we tried to measure for specifically, there was an indication that it was something else. So it looked like it might have been a temperature change, which it didn't then measure for temperature change, and it looked like it was static electricity. And it was the same effect, and it just kept on switching its mode of operation. And George has done a lot of work in that area. And so otherwise, I think it's really kind of a big area to get into with the way his perspective.
Fair enough. But, I mean, you think there is something to that whole notion?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely worth looking at, yeah.
Okay. Do you think that... well, we know...
I want to say it's all worth looking at.
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, this has been a big thing, at least in the UFO stuff that we've been looking at, where we do find things that George has talked about. And one of the things that I've brought up numerous times on the show is that the paranormal in general, if you can contain it in some kind of box to even discuss it, always seems to have an escape hatch of some sort. And I wonder often, is that a purposeful thing, or is that just the nature of the reality that it operates in?
If you consider just the very nature of certain issues about quantum physics, is it a wave? Is it a particle? It's not one thing; it's the other.
Right.
So things exist in an indeterminate state, and consciousness itself may be indeterminate in that sense, and so it may resist hunting down.
Yeah. I mean, I could see that. I mean, do you? Here's another thing that comes up on the show that I'd be amiss if I didn't ask. 3 a.m. Seems to be a very popular time.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, look, first of all, there's something about 3 a.m., just from an environmental perspective, in most towns, not the case in Las Vegas, by the way.
Really?
In most towns, 3 a.m., things quiet down. The air has settled, and depending on the weather conditions, the air has settled down. It's not 3 a.m. exactly. It's somewhere around the middle of the night in that point.
Right.
But the air quality is a little different. It's cooled down enough. It hasn't started warming back up. The environment itself is fairly quiet. Any animals out there are relatively quiet. So it's a quiet time, which means that if something happens, it's easier to notice it. That's why I say Las Vegas is not the case, because that's 24 hours.
Right.
But this idea that that's perpetrated by the folks on Paranormal State, that it's dead time and the best time to notice ghosts. I got news for you. While I've had a couple of cases where things happen at 3 a.m., there's a reason they happen at 3 a.m. because they were related to a pattern of the living who did something at 3 a.m., not because the dead were there at 3 a.m. And it's middle of the night. Most of don't report ghosts between midnight and 6 a.m. They don't. You know why?
No.
They're sleeping, or they've been kidnapped by aliens.
Yeah, they're not awakened by them, yeah.
That's right. So, to say 3 a.m. is a good time, that's totally bogus, considering the fact that most of the reports we get, and have gotten for over 130 years, have been from the early morning to the early evening with the lights on or in sunlight. Now, of course, in the 1800s, the lights were either gaslight or candles, so it was dimmer, but we're still talking about this being unrelated to whether the lights are on or off, and unrelated to time, except the time that if it's a patterned issue, then it has to do with that pattern. If it is, when things actually originally happened, or it's the intention of the ghost.
Well, see, I mean, in the sense of studying human perception, we've studied altered states on here via psychedelics and other things, and one of the things that comes up time after time is the pineal gland and the release of dimethyltryptamine, which is produced in the brain. And one of its high points of times, according to Dr. Rick Strassman and others, is around the 3 a.m. mark, is where we have this DMT dump of sorts, which is responsible for intense dreams and this kind of thing.
Which would explain certain types of things, and would certainly explain, if people woke up at that time, hypnagogic, hypnopompic experiences that may also be psychic in nature because they're waking up at that time.
Right. So we don't separate those necessarily out as being not real. I mean, this is everybody's big thing is what's real and what isn't real. And I often say, well, it's a matter of human perception as to what real means.
Right. And for the most part, we're studying subjective paranormal experiences. We're not studying objective paranormal, because no experience is objective. All experience is subjective.
Absolutely agree. In ufology, this is something that's come up more recently in regards to the abduction phenomena, is the sense of outlier data. Everyone knows, I think by this time, it's pretty much culturally ingrained that what the typical abduction scenario is: waking up in a light, you're right on a table, you're surrounded by beings, blah, 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 ad nauseum. There's been other things that have come to light in recent months, I would say, at least with this show, of the more bizarre aspects of this, that essentially what the media has put out has been sort of gleaned from bad research, I would say.
Yeah.
And there are very, very bizarre things that have been purposefully left out of essential information and literature on the subject. Do you run into this often where somebody says to you, look, I know this is already hard to believe, but then this happened? And do you have the truly, truly bizarre instances that come up in your research at all?
I have to tell you that generally the answer to that is no. Most of my colleagues, the answer to that would be no as well, except when we talk to people who, and we don't know for sure that the experience is not real for them. The problem is they come from people who very clearly have other kinds, have a clear psychological disturbance. So, for example, I get a lot of calls from people throughout the year who claim that this group or that group is psychically attacking them and making them sick, and sending telepathic messages to them, or trying to make them ill, or ruining their lives. I had somebody who actually tried to blame losing his job. And I can't remember what company it was, but the company went under. So losing his job on this group, on a group that was mysteriously psychically attacking him and ruining his life, and he lost his wife and the whole thing. It's like, buddy, I'm sorry, but life just doesn't work that way. There are issues around that, and that's where the bizarre stuff comes in. And there's a couple of issues here. One, I think the truly bizarre, like, for example, it's unlikely that someone who thinks that they have a demon and has a full-on what they would call a demonic experience. And you probably know from reading my chapter in that book, and if you read the Ghost Detective Guide to Haunted San Francisco, the other book, we're pretty clear about that too. No demons. That's a very religious-based phenomenon. It doesn't work that way. But people would probably not call parapsychologists. These days they might call ghost hunters, but they're not going to call parapsychologists. They might call the church. So we may not get the reports of the most bizarre stuff because of a simple reporting artifact.
Okay. Well, all that said, you brought up the cultural thing there. This is in your book as well. We've talked about cultural filters in this show a lot, and how, perception is colored by that, how all of that works. Now, we've often said maybe the classic facade of the alien is not actually what it is, and we are simply perceiving something else. And through cultural contamination, I guess you could say, we are assembling this thing. And the question is it our mind that is perceiving this, or, this is the question for you, I suppose, is, do you think it's our mind perceiving it a certain way, or do you think that this phenomena, whatever it may be, is presenting to us in a way that we can understand it? Is it wearing a mask?
I think that some psychic phenomena probably does wear a metaphorical mask. We can only perceive it in certain ways. And certainly it works the other way around. People are not perceiving things that are there because they don't want to. The disbelievers and other folks who just simply would be too afraid if they had a ghost experience. But perception is, everybody perceives something, and how that gets filtered is a big question. The reactions, in my field, it's typically the reactions to the experience that are more culturally based, what people think of it. A good example is the shadow phenomenon.
Right.
People see a shadow, they think that the shadow is evil because it's dark. And right away, that's a very visceral human reaction. And there's no basis in real experience for that, because we know many situations where there's a shadow and then the shadow resolves eventually into Granddad, who was really upset that people are running away from him.
Okay.
So for whatever reason they didn't perceive Granddad as more than a shadow, or that just because it's dark doesn't mean it's bad. And there's other issues around all that. That's very cultural, but it's very, very much human ingrained fear of the unknown, fear of the dark kind of thing. It's an animal instinct.
Well, I mean, people often, and this is one of the biggest questions I wanted to ask you. I'm glad I just remembered it. One of the biggest masks, I guess I could say, or facade that people see is a cloaked figure. Can you tell me what kind of representation that is, where that might come from? I mean, this seems to be really, really prevalent for me as well.
Interesting, because actually I've talked to a couple people who've seen the Grim Reaper, actually.
Okay.
But for the most part, the cloaked thing, for actual ghost experiences, for haunting experiences, it's pretty, pretty rare. The shadow thing often ends up relating to something pretty real later on, or someone who was real later on. Mm-hmm. But the cloak thing, I don't think, it's really not prevalent in the literature, in people's reports. One of my colleagues, Joni McMahon, did a study actually on sightings of the Grim Reaper, and there's actually even a book about that. And that's a very, very archetypal figure. I actually had a case, my very first case, the figure that was seen was a metaphor for something going on in the unconscious of one of the people, and it was a black knight, a person dressed in black armor. And actually the woman said to me, if she hadn't been seeing him before Star Wars, she would have said, when she saw Darth Vader, she freaked out a little bit because it looked just like that. But Lucas specifically chose that image because it was very archetypal, the archetypal black knight.
Right.
So there are issues of archetypes in our unconscious that keep coming through, and we may get a signal of something, and for whatever reason our individual mind says, oh, God, I've got to be afraid of that, so it must be a spooky thing. On the other hand, we may get a sense of death impending, and we may see the Grim Reaper because that's what we're taught we're going to see.
I see. Well,
or for all I know, there could be a guy named Death or Mort.
I could fill your ear for a while about what I've seen as far as the cloaked figure in this house. But anyway, we're kind of at the end here, and I've got to ask you to come back. I know you're such a busy guy, and we had a hell of a time getting you on the air tonight, but because you are incredibly busy with your work and all sorts of projects, but we would love to have you come back. Again, and talk more deeply about some of these issues. This is a good primer for everyone on you. But nonetheless, thank you so very much for coming on.
Sure.
And discussing this stuff with us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, let me just mention, I'd like to mention a couple of things real quick.
Absolutely.
First, you mentioned the Ghost Spirits and Hauntings book, which is a really great book, great anthology for people who are just interested in the ghost phenomena. The Ghost Detective's Guide to Haunted San Francisco, which came out a few months ago, co-written by Annette Martin, a psychic I worked with for many years who passed away, will give you an insight into what it's like to go with a psychic and a parapsychologist on an investigation. That's the comment we got from most people. They felt like they were with us, in fact, because there's transcripts of some of our stuff in there, or discussions. And then coming up in October 14th through 16th, there is a major conference on parapsychology for the general public at Atlantic University and the Association for Research and Enlightenment in Virginia Beach, Virginia, which people can find through Atlantic University, or if you go to atlanticuniv.edu. And then I'm going to be speaking in Phoenix on the 26th of October with Dr. Barry Taff of the Entity fame at the Herberger Theater, and then I'll be at the Forever Family Foundation conference in November 12th, for a presentation called "Is There Chocolate in the Afterlife?" And
that's the other thing. Why don't you you became a chocolatier, eh?
Yeah, because I didn't have enough to do in my life.
Do you have a website for that?
Yes, it's www.hauntedbychocolate.com.
Of course it is. Fantastic. And all of those will be on our homepage as this airs, so everybody can head to our homepage and hit those links. I'd love to make the Virginia Beach thing. That'd be fantastic. So maybe we'll have to take a pilgrimage for that.
That'd be great.
All right, sir. Thank you very, very much once again. And
thank you, Jeff.
We'll have you back on soon.
Sounds good.
And that, ladies and gents, is Loyd Auerbach. Many thanks to Loyd again for doing the show, and all of his links are on our homepage at www.paratopia.net. I will be back for a little chat. Oh, well, listen to that. It ain't metal, is it? But what the hell, it's free. Hopefully I'll be back with Jeremy in an after chat right after this.
If you record audio for any purpose, chances are you want it to be heard. You want to attract the largest audience possible who can hear your message. That's where we come in. We're CyberEars.com, a revolutionary internet service that will host your audio files and help you promote and track its popularity. Considering hosting a podcast to the world? We have all the automated tools to make the process as simple and easy as it can be. No technical mumbo-jumbo to work out. CyberEars.com does all the work for you. You record it, we take care of the rest. So don't delay. Go to CyberEars.com today and register for a free trial account. Upload your audio files and get heard. With CyberEars.com, it's your audio on your terms.
I had such a great Iron Maiden track picked out for here. That damn copyright law again. Anyway, Jeremy fighting exhaustion and a move and the lack of an internet connection is going to join me for the after chat. So props to him. So here's our after chat for the Loyd Auerbach interview.
So the Jeff.
So the Jer.
How did the interview go?
It went well. I mean, Lloyd's a tough one to get, man. He's got a hugely busy schedule, and this show is actually dedicated to Annette Martin, who was his co-author on the Ghost Detectives book, which is the Guide to Haunted San Francisco. I think literally right before we were supposed to have him on, she passed away rather suddenly, as far as he was concerned, suddenly. And so our condolences to her family and to Lloyd for that. But he's just an excruciatingly busy guy, and so to get him on for an hour was great. And it was more or less an introductory episode. I mean, that's what it was. And so we didn't get too deep into any one thing. But, you know, I think he covered enough about what parapsychology actually is, which was, I don't know, I guess somewhat different than what I thought. It is.
You thought it was what? Nothing?
I didn't see it as, and maybe it still isn't such a rigid science as such, but certainly when you're talking about, you know, experimental controls and controlled environments and that sort of thing, and they're very, very careful about what they do. And what I find interesting about that is he talks about how the media has kind of, poisoned the public opinion, just like, you know, certain abduction cults have poisoned our little pool. Like you look at ghost hunters and they kind of take on this air that they are using scientific instrumentation and taking readings and all of that. And they really don't even know sort of what that means when it gets down to the end of the day. I mean, they can only surmise that this EMF reading equals, if it's not environmental issues like wiring, then it must be a spirit. And that's really not how it's done. And people like that, who kind of take that bend of trying to approach it scientifically, don't use typically psychics. And in fact, parapsychology does employ psychics after they've been, I'm assuming, properly screened and tested in a controlled environment and all of that. Then you have that. And something that he brought up as one of the big talking points is this notion of paranormal phenomena erupting in conjunction with a person, which they kind of label agents of a paranormal event. So there are people who are, you know, the lightning rod in the situation. And he talked about one young man who was, they had moved into a house, and essentially the whole family was seeing a spirit in the house. And he said one of the ways that you can really define or qualify that something strange is going on is if the person comes out of an experience with a ghost where they are told something they could not possibly know. And this case, in this particular case, he was talking about very, very specific information to this person's life and contacts that they could contact to verify who she was and that she lived there, and she didn't die in the house, she died in the hospital. And I asked him, essentially, do you ever ask the question, what do you see? What is your environment? What do you remember about death? I mean, why are you here? That sort of thing. I mean, the most baseline questions, where are you? That sort of thing. And he said, yeah, in fact, they did ask that. And the woman conveyed to this young man that she remembers being in the hospital, knowing she was going to die. She closed her eyes, and the next thing she knew, she was back home. And so it was fairly seamless. There was no tunnel of light or anything like that talked about. And the other question being, well, what's with the clothes? Ghosts are often seen not naked, but wearing clothes. And the way that the spirit had explained it to this man was that essentially it's like residual self-image from the Matrix. It's one of those I could appear however my mood strikes me. If I'm very happy and I'm feeling vivacious, I guess I'm going to appear young to you. It's their visual to us depends on them. And I guess to some degree ourselves. So, but this. And
then what do they do? Then what's the day in the life of this ghost?
Well, that was the thing. I think he mentioned something about that time to them is like not. It feels completely disconnected from time. Time doesn't seem to have any bearing to a spirit from their perception. And this is only one case that he brought up as an example to me of, how do you qualify what's going on? I mean, this boy was basically given a phone number to call and a man's name and, to verify who this was. And, he just relayed it to Loyd and I suppose another investigator as he was being told it from the spirit. I mean, that's how prevalent this spirit was in the home. So... I mean, all of that kind of stuff is just is fascinating as hell. And you don't, where is this stuff? You just don't hear about this. This is not the kind of case where, you can pick up a book and read about something like that going on. I mean, either
Did
go ahead.
Did you ask him or get a sense of maybe even, if they're so stringent with how they do things, then you got to think that that's because they maybe want to be taken seriously as a science. And if they're not, well, since they're not, I should say, is that perturbing? Is it all for naught in that sense? Or do they just carry on in the hopes that, science will one day go, okay, we're going to take a look at your work?
Well, as far as where it started, I was surprised. The history of this goes back 130 years. And at the very inception of parapsychology, there was scientists were involved, and I suppose it hit the spiritualist movement hit, and there became a lot of fakes and hoaxes and all that sort of thing, and that's when the pool started to get pissed in, and that's when it became a lot less serious to mainstream science. They began to kind of ignore that and go the materialist route. And kind of left it behind in the dirt. So, I don't see it as being that much different from ufology. When ufology first started, you had some pretty serious people involved with it, and as time has gone on, it's gotten more and more marginal. It's kind of worked the same way. Are they ever going to be, is that the hope that they're going to be taken seriously as a science? I don't know. They certainly treat it with great care in what they document, how they document. When you write stuff in a book that, for my money, and I said this to him in the interview, I'd have bought this book on his chapter alone because there's so many things in there you don't realize when you think about ghost investigations and an EMF detector or any of the quote-unquote technological tools that aren't even being used right. That aren't even, this is not what they were used for. I mean, for instance, the photography thing. The object, when a camera was first employed into a ghost situation, it wasn't to catch a ghost. It was to catch the people faking the ghost. And that's how it started. So all of this stuff really, has an interesting history as to how far back it goes and why certain things came to be, the EMF detector and all that sort of thing, why that all came into being something that is a staple these days of ghost hunting.
Did he mention the spirit con?
No. No. I mean, even so far as looking at, we've talked about that dynamic in ufology where nobody shares data and it's a very territorial thing and all of that. And he says this in the book, and this is something that I kind of tried to lean into a little bit when it came to marginality and anti-structure, because that leads to groups not lasting very long.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to read this from the book because it's so damn similar to what we see in ufology. He says, finally, it's incredibly disconcerting to see the very same people continuously asserting that there needs to be cohesiveness and cooperation to the paranormal field, trashing the work of others. Groups become territorial about their areas. They form teams with logos and T-shirts and vehicle signs and make being in the right group more important than actual investigations and certainly more important than the client. Many of us looking at this see it as gang behavior with all its territoriality, colors, and competition for cases rather than cooperation. So it's the same gig. It's the same thing. That divide of, this case is mine or this location is mine, and you don't go there.
But isn't that the same in every profession? I mean, isn't that the whole reason that the Homeland Security came into business? Because the FBI and the cops and the CIA and NSA weren't talking to each other.
Exactly.
Isn't it the same in any science,
It probably is. It probably is. I've always looked at least ufology as, it seems to me to be immediately suspicious if you've done everything that you're supposed to do in investigating a case. Just say it's a photographic case, and you've done everything right, then it shouldn't be any problem to hand over photographs to somebody else to look at the work. If you're confident enough in what you've done, why wouldn't you give it to them and let them kind of say what they think? Where the problem comes in is that people try to lay too much on it. They try to make too many proclamations about what they think they've discovered, and then they become territorial about maybe not so much the case, but their conclusions about it. Because to have someone come out and refute that with some kind of proof that maybe was overlooked or was ignored because this person was going for one answer or another, is to be made to look foolish in a way. I mean, we're seeing that in science, of course, but I'm sure it's across the board in every kind of interest and every kind of science or anything that has to be researched. I'm sure that's what happens, but I think at least in the ghost hunting thing, it is about let's go in with our logo shirts on and try to look professional and all that sort of thing. So, I don't know. It's interesting to me that that so much of what you see ghost hunting groups out there on TV kind of saying is stuff that parapsychology already knew about and already kind of talked about years ago. And a lot of these groups now are making out like this is a big discovery that we're just tripping onto this now. And in fact, it's been known about for a long time.
Well, there's another way to look at that, which is, isn't it great that these people completely ignorant of what's already been laid before them are discovering the exact same thing?
Exactly.
There's repeatability. You know?
Exactly. But parapsychology being more along the lines of studying consciousness and perception, which is what we've talked about the whole time, this whole nature of perception and cultural filters and religious filters and all of that coming into play. I mean, this is stuff that they've brought up in this little chapter here at the end of this book. And, when you get questions like, here's one of the ones that he says, here are some questions that parapsychologists have pondered for more than 100 years, and how the early researchers first conceived of the answers, most of which still hold up under scrutiny. How do ghosts perceive without senses? And the answer to that is that they use psi processes, whether it be clairvoyance, clairaudience, and so on, to pick up information. Now, how do they know this? I have no idea. How do ghosts speak if they lack a voice box? Since very few people can actually hear a ghost voice, it's likely a mental projection that some witnesses are able to perceive psychically. As not all recorders pick up the voice at the same time, it's likely a PK effect of the ghost on the recording device. So, when you have somebody like Dave Roundtree come in and say, that EVPs are picked up in a certain frequency, and so you don't need the diaphragm and a microphone, you just need the coil because it's not audible sound anyway. That kind of almost speaks to that, even though they're approaching it from two different angles. You're still looking at whatever the phenomena is kind of imposing itself upon an electronic device, rather than some kind of thing where you have to turn the volume up because it's so faint. It's not an audible thing. It just seems like a lot more stringent a study than ufology and ghost hunting. I mean, all of those.
But does he see the cross-pollination or the cross threads between all this stuff, including, Puckwudgies, Bigfoot, whatever?
We didn't really get into Puckwudgies and Bigfoot, but, there were crossovers that got brought up during the interview about, about perception, about cultural filters and all that sort of thing. And apparently he did some work with Hynek many, many years ago, I guess for the Center for UFO Studies. So he was into UFOs for a bit. But this has been pretty much his life's pursuit. I mean, he started his first paranormal or parapsychology group in high school. It was just like an after-school club type of thing. And they wrote to the Rhine Institute and communicated with them. And they were giving kind of like little exercises to do, like about perception and consciousness and all of these kind of things. So I think the only thing I was surprised at was the use of psychics. I would love to be in the room when they're actually screening a psychic and they find one that they think is worthy of, further work.
Well, do you think you could hook us up with an approved psychic?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to write.
Like to interview one.
Yeah, I would too. I mean, it's. I think that would be something I would really have to see because, like I said, I guess more than anybody else, or just as much as anybody else, the psychic thing, in a way, I can kind of see where some people might have an ability to do something, but it all seems very flimsy and uncertain to me, I guess. That's just my opinion. Some people hit on some things, other times not so much, but, what is the ratio of failure that you put on a psychic to say, yes, they've got something going on, or no, they don't? I don't know. I don't know. That just is something I was kind of surprised that, as stringent as it is, they must apply that same kind of rigid notion to screening psychics. But they do use them, and that is an interest to them. So, but anyway, moving on, all of basically everything, including you missed this part of the interview, Jeremy. Loyd recently became a chocolatier. As if,
I'm sorry.
That's right. That's right. He makes chocolate.
Wow.
And so he's got a website for that. So all of those links, including his all of his parapsychological work and the chocolate work, which I'm going to the chocolate site first, I think, is on our webpage.
No free samples, huh?
I don't think so. Just hit our website, www.paratopia.net. And they're all on the homepage underneath this show. So go check them out.
Nice.
So other than that, is there anything more that we wanted to talk about as far as Project Core goes? Do we want to reiterate yet again the premise of this entire thing? I feel like we need to drive a stake through this thing's heart to make it very clear.
Yeah.
So this is going to be 10 months live on the net from day one to the end, and the prerequisites for this are going to be on the webpage. Here are the rules: no hypnotically retrieved stuff, number one, and nothing left out. Which brings me back to something that Loyd had said on the show, and maybe I didn't phrase it well enough, but I don't care how bizarre your experience is. I don't care if in the middle of an abduction you were presented with a chocolate cake or asked to go find the dodo bird. I don't care how bizarre it sounds. We want to know about it. Don't worry about the yes or no questions. Nothing is going to negate, in the way of those questions, nothing in there would really negate the account that you are telling us about. Or accounts, if you can summarize them quickly into a couple, that would be fine too. There will be limited space in which to type this summary. These questions about you pretty much run the gambit. It's a broad study. This is not focusing in on any one singular thing. This could be a ghost experience, an alien experience. If you've experienced PK or ESP or any of that sort of thing, we would like to know about it. And so all of this stuff will kind of get amalgamated into one email where all of this data will be collected. It'll be safe. It is anonymous for now. You will get some kind of, we're going to try to make some kind of unique identifier, or we're going to have you type in a 4-character identifier into the form field that only you know. And that way we can all discuss your particular case amongst, the 4 of us, which is the 2 doctors and Jeremy and I.
Yes.
Which sounds
all equally qualified.
Right.
Good
Yeah.
job.
So yeah, I mean, it's, I think it's going to be great. And I think it's broad enough that we can maybe find something that we can want to pursue further in the next 10 months. In other words, in 10 months when this is over, it's not really over. We're going to take a few months to go over what we've collected, and then we're going to reformulate our questions, and we're going to ask for a different set of data maybe out of the next one. I mean, who knows where this could go? I don't think anybody on the team really has an expectation of where it's going to go. And that's the good part about it is we have no preconceived ideas about what we might find as far as connective threads through everything. I certainly have some preconceived notions about what kind of data we might get. In a way, I'm almost expectant of stories like Kelly's, I mean, aren't you expecting some of those?
I hope so.
Yeah, well. I mean, that's kind of what I'm hoping for, but I don't know that we'll get them all like that. But that's the general premise.
Well, when you say stories like Kelly's, what is it specifically? You mean the content or just the clarity?
I would say more the clarity of that, and the
clearer the better.
Well, yeah, I mean, and the crossover of, what most people, I guess, would call a cryptid to ghost to UFOs. I mean, if you've had more than one experience, don't be afraid, to climb out on that ledge, because it's not going to break from underneath of you on this little questionnaire. If you've got a ghost, thing that's happened in your house or out and about, and then a UFO thing the next month, we'll take both of those in the same submittal. I know that for a lot of people, it's going to be kind of like, well, if I say I've had this, are they going to believe me if I, go this far? Go as far as you want. I don't think this is. I don't know. On some level, I feel like people are going to be a little apprehensive about, number one, some of the radio button questions that are going to be on there. And then on the other half, I think, how much are people going to be willing to put out there, even in anonymous form like this, and think that it's going to be taken seriously? I mean, we're going to take every report we get seriously. It's going to be looked at and evaluated and then cross-checked with other experiences. So, as wild as it gets, as off the wall as it gets, or as weird as it gets, try to describe it as best you can, and ye shall not be judged. So there it is.
Yeah, I don't think that'll be the problem. I think the problem will be the 25 questions, if there is a problem at all.
Yeah. Well, that's... a
lot of that gets into health issues and things like that. And, people are wary of putting that info out there.
Exactly.
And then also wary of saying, oh, is this your answer to this then?
Yeah.
I mean, I would just say, just don't guess what our motives are, because we don't have them.
That's true. Yeah. I mean, pretty much everybody threw in a box of questions, and we're going to whittle those down. Probably over the weekend, but we'll whittle those down even further, to get our base questions. But some of them are coming from Tyler, and some are coming from me, and some are coming from Jared. And no, there's nothing that we're particularly looking for, but these are all, I don't know, they're pointed questions, but none of them are going to negate what you tell us. So that's the important thing to keep in mind. And we're not really trying to attribute anything to any of the questions that are underneath the form fill. So just be honest about them. And if we don't have honesty in this, then it's pretty much a worthless endeavor. If people can't be upfront and forthright about it, then that's immediately going to be a problem. So that's the numero uno important thing. If you care enough to write this stuff down for us and to answer the questions, just, for God's sakes, be honest about what you're putting down. That's all I ask. Unless you click the fiction button. And then we know you're full of shit. So, that's about it. So, back to normal next week, Jerry, you think?
You mean with me?
Yeah.
The show?
Yeah.
I think so, yeah. I mean, we should be back to normal probably for Sunday's show.
Okay,
Paratopia Live.
Paratopia Live, yes. Well,
now, for the fiction on Project Core, are should we specify then that when you fill out the 25 questions, that you'd be filling out as a person what you think would apply to a person who really did have this happen to them?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. We'll have all this, written up in a little paragraph at the top of the page, where basically we explain what we're after and everything that I've just said, pretty much summarized. So, Well, I mean, I think, or at least I hope, that listeners will throw the link far and wide so we get a lot of responses, number one. But what I'm really interested in is what statistically comes out of this, because, one of the participants in this is somebody who does statistics in, is that, I don't even remember what he does statistics in, do you?
Yeah, no, we should probably know that, huh?
I just don't know it off the top of my head. He has said, all of that, but, this is what the man does, and I think that'll be pretty interesting to do. And then when we get all this done, we're probably just going to put it out. We're probably just going to release it on the website and let everybody look, and then move on with the next part of it. So we'll just see what happens. I mean, I think it's going to be interesting one way or another.
It'll be fun reading.
Yes. So we'll be all set for Sunday, and
yes.
And can we safely assume then that there will be no Iron Maiden intro or extra tracks in the next podcast?
I'm sorry, what?
Good night, everybody.
Oh, good. Good night.